Scorpions, the armored tanks of the arachnid world, boast one of the most fearsomely designed chassis you're likely to encounter outside of a video game. With a lineage that stretches back to a time when the Earth was essentially in early access mode, these critters have been skulking around since before the developers decided to roll out the massive terrestrial server expansion pack. Decked out with menacing pincers and a stinger that's the envy of the venomous community, scorpions are the embodiment of "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" in evolutionary terms. Yet, one can't help but wonder if their ancient blueprint stands up to the power creep that's infiltrated the game over eons. Let's deep dive into the spec sheet and unique abilities scorpions bring to the battleground, shall we? Before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's nod to CuriosityStream for enabling us to scrutinize these eight-legged tanks without the risk of getting stung. First off, scorpions are like the OGs of the predatory world, rocking a design so robust it scarcely needed any patches or updates to keep them competitive. Their strategy? A terrifying blend of brute force via their pincers, combined with a chemical warfare department housed in their tail. It's an approach that screams, "I was dominating the leaderboard when your evolutionary ancestors were still figuring out multicellularity." However, as any gamer knows, being first to the party doesn't guarantee you'll be the last one standing once power levels start to escalate. The contemporary meta is a vastly different landscape, filled with creatures that have adapted absurdly OP strategies for survival and combat. In this context, the Scorpion's tried-and-true method of grab and stab might seem a tad vintage. Analyzing their stats, Scorpions have maximized their defense and attack, opting for a build that emphasizes resilience and lethality over speed or social skills. They're the loners of the natural world, preferring solo quests over guild activities, a strategy that has served them well in the lower tiers, but might limit their scalability in more diverse environments. Now, where do they stand on the tier list? It's a mixed bag. On one hand, Scorpions have undeniable staying power, having maintained a consistent player base through countless balance patches and server resets. Their venomous stinger is a one-hit KO for most small to medium matchups, and their armor plating gives them a hefty defense stat that makes them tough to take down in a fair fight. On the flip side, their ancient tactics, while effective against traditional opponents, struggle against the new breeds of power gamers. The mammalian and avian classes in particular have developed counter-strategies that exploit the Scorpion's slower speed and solitary nature. Scorpions, the ancient gladiators of the arachnid world, strut into the ecological arena with stats that scream middle management. They're the office workers of the natural world, not particularly outstanding in any one area, but not dropping the ball either, except of course when it comes to mobility and intelligence. But let's face it, when you're designed like a tank with a built-in biochemical weapon, who needs to be quick-witted or speedy? Their offensive capabilities are commendable, boasting an arsenal that would make any medieval warrior jealous. The claws? Think of them as nature's own Swiss Army knife, adept at grappling, with a side of slicing and dicing for good measure. Then there's the pièce de résistance, the venomous stinger, a biological syringe filled with a concoction so potent it could drop opponents in their tracks, assuming, of course, they can land the hit. It's a big if, reminiscent of trying to land a dart while blindfolded, spinning in circles. Defense-wise, they're wrapped in the arthropod equivalent of chainmail armor, the standard issue for most members of the creepy crawly contingent. This chitinous covering is just enough to ward off attacks from similarly sized adversaries, letting the Scorpion ready its retaliatory strike. But let's not sugarcoat it. Against anything bigger, they might as well be wearing paper mache. This armor doubles as a shield against the whims of Mother Nature, like those pesky sandstorms that frequent their desert haunts. Yet in the grand scheme of things, it's akin to bringing an umbrella to a hurricane. When it comes to stealth, scorpions could give ninjas a run for their money, blending into their surroundings with a proficiency that's enviable. Their flat bodies aren't just for show, allowing them to squeeze into tight spots where they can plot their next move or simply take a breather. This, combined with their burrowing talents, makes them adept at the old hit-and-run tactic. But when push comes to shove, this reliance on stealth highlights a glaring issue. Against the heavyweight champions of the animal kingdom, they're sorely outclassed. Their venom, while formidable, isn't the deterrent they'd like it to be, crumbling under the pressure of a real challenge. Now let's talk brain power, or the lack thereof. Scorpions are rocking the same cognitive setup they had when dinosaurs were doing their thing. In the prehistoric expansions, when the landscape was less National Geographic and more Survivor Paleozoic edition, being smart was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Sensory capabilities were the extent of their mental gymnastics, and frankly, not much has changed. In a world where brain over brawn is increasingly the winning strategy, scorpions are decidedly old school. Those ancient armored warriors of the desert, wielding their claws and stinger like a medieval knight who hasn't quite gotten the hang of his weapons. They strut into battle with all the confidence of a creature that hasn't quite realized the game has evolved without them. When their initial grapple move misses, which happens with the kind of frequency that would embarrass a stormtrooper, their battle plan starts to resemble Swiss cheese, full of holes and not particularly intimidating. The accuracy of their venomous coup de grace is laughably poor, akin to trying to thread a needle during an earthquake. It's so easily evaded that one wonders if the scorpion's prey are sent a prior memo, giving them a heads up. Worse yet, their prized stinger, far from being the invulnerable weapon of death they'd like it to be, is as susceptible to damage as the rest of their exoskeleton-clad body. It turns out that targeting a scorpion's stinger is the equivalent of shooting the exhaust port on the Death Star, a surefire way to bring them down. And let's talk about those claws, shall we? If the scorpion's claws were entered into an arthropod strength contest, they'd be outperformed by hermit crabs and lobsters, who, unlike our desert dwellers, can actually claim their vice-like grips pack a punch. Scorpions wielding their claws in combat is akin to bringing a butter knife to a sword fight, not exactly the stuff of nightmares unless you're an unarmored insect. The real kicker comes when scorpions face off against multiple adversaries. With no area of effect attacks or any semblance of a quick getaway, they're about as well prepared for a group battle as a paper bag is for a rainstorm. Overwhelmed and outmaneuvered, they're like a beleaguered hero in a zombie movie, realizing too late they're not the protagonist after all. Even their much-touted grab attacks leave much to be desired. They depend on the tiny ridges of their claws to hold on to their prey, a strategy about as reliable as a discount parachute. Armored opponents simply laugh off these attempts, slipping through the scorpion's grasp with the ease of a politician dodging questions. And if by some miracle they do manage to hold on, trying to land a sting on a well-armored target is like trying to pierce a tank with a toothpick. Diving into the matchups of the arachnid world, let's face the harsh reality for scorpions. The outlook isn't great. They find themselves in the unenviable position of being the middle child in the ecosystem's family portrait, overshadowed by more specialized builds and outright countered by creatures that have seemingly spec'd specifically to make their lives miserable. It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight only to find out the other guy brought a tank. Let's start with the bad matchups, a list that's embarrassingly long for our eight-legged friends. The top of the do not engage list includes any critter that's decided to armor up. It turns out evolution has spawned creatures with puncture-resistant armor that makes the scorpion's venomous sting about as threatening as a stern letter. Mammals like the shrew and mongoose, meanwhile, have built up a resistance to venom that makes them the scorpion's kryptonite. These guys have essentially taken a leaf out of the scorpion's playbook, laughed, and then written their own guide on how to be invincible against venom attacks. Then there are the beetles, nature's tanks, whose round armor is perfectly designed to make a scorpion's sting as effective as a pebble thrown at a battleship. While these beetle builds aren't exactly offensive powerhouses, trying to turn one into dinner is like trying to open a can without a can opener, frustrating and ultimately futile. It's less of a battle and more of an exercise in futility. But the real nightmare scenario for any scorpion is stumbling upon ants. The mere mention probably sends shivers down their exoskeleton. Scorpions facing an ant swarm is akin to a single player trying to fend off an entire army. It's not a battle, it's a massacre waiting to happen. Scorpions, with their solo player mentality and lack of area of effect abilities, have about as much chance against a swarm as a snowball in a desert. What we have, then, is a creature stuck in an evolutionary arms race, but running with weights on its legs. The scorpion, with its ancient design and venerable combat tactics, finds itself outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outclassed by adversaries that have either evolved specifically to counter its strengths or, through sheer biological innovation, have rendered its most potent weapons obsolete. Navigating the perilous battlegrounds of the natural world, scorpions find themselves in a complex game of rock, paper, scissors, where every encounter could be their last.